Hey guys, what's up? Chris Blow, I'm back with another video, and today I'm going to be talking about what rent structures and lease types you may run into while looking for office space. So as I mentioned in my last video, commercial space is usually quoted on a per square foot basis, but you may hear a number of qualifiers following this number, from full service, triple net, industrial gross, and on. So what do these mean? Starting from the easiest to understand, a full service lease is going to include all the costs associated with renting baked into one number. So the number that you see is the number that you pay. Although these will typically exclude things such as cable, internet, and phone, but it includes the operating expenses, so your CAMs, your insurance, your taxes, so you don't have to worry about paying those. On the other end of the spectrum, a triple net lease is a quoted number where it excludes, or it's net of, all of these operating expenses. So your common area maintenance, your janitorial, as well as the insurance and property taxes. So you'll still pay a separate operating expense number in addition to the quoted triple net rent. And then when these are added together, it'll be to gross, or you'll have an equivalent number that you can compare to the full service number. So we've talked about the two most basic types of lease structure, the full service and the triple net. But you'll also see a wide range of rent structures and lease types that fall in between these two. For example, you may have a modified triple net lease. In other words, it's a triple net lease, but maybe one or two of the expenses have been included in the triple net component of the rent. So maybe they're quoting a number that includes the property taxes and the insurance, but they're not including the utilities. So this is pretty common for industrial parks and is sometimes called industrial gross rent. Because you can imagine that if you have a large industrial complex and some of the users are a dead warehouse space, but some of the users maybe are a life science company, they're going to have very different utility requirements that are going to be using very different amounts of power. So in this case, it's better to sub-meter and have those individual tenants paying that component of the expenses on their own, but the real estate taxes and the insurance, which are maybe more consistent, can be included in that triple net quoted rent. So it's also worth noting that these types of lease structures can have an impact on the responsibility of you as a tenant. So for example, in your average triple net lease, a tenant will be responsible for maintaining the interior parts of their space, right? So what's inside their four walls, and they'll also be paying towards the common area maintenance. But usually they're not required to pay for the capital improvements. So say the building needs a new HVAC, or the owner wants to do a remodel of the exterior of the building. Typically, these are not going to be passed through to the tenant, although it is something you should check in your lease, because at the end of the day, whatever your lease says dictates what you're going to pay. But there is such thing as an absolute triple net lease, in which case the tenant takes on all the responsibility. So you'll see this sometimes with fast food franchises or drugstores, where there's an owner of the property and then there's the entity leasing it, so a CVS, but it's an absolute triple net lease. So they're taking on all of the responsibilities. They're paying the insurance, the property taxes, the operating expenses, but they're also paying for the HVAC maintenance. They're paying for maintaining the exterior walls as well as the interior of the building. So now let's do a quick comparison to see how this can play out when you're looking for office space. So let's say you've found two spaces that you like. One is quoting on a triple net basis and asking $4 triple net. The other building is asking $5 full service. So at first glance, the $4 triple net rent building may look like the better deal. However, we have to dive in and understand what the extra expenses that you'll be paying, what the operating expenses look like. So in this case, let's say that the insurance, the property taxes, and the utilities add up to $1.25. So on a gross basis, that rent is now $5.25 per square foot per month. So now that's the more expensive option. But we have to dig a little bit deeper than even this, because the full service model, yes, it includes everything, but it's not really fully transparent, because you're still paying in one way or another for these expenses, right? And so usually owners have what's called a base year expense stop. So let's say that you're renting space when this video comes out in early 2019. The owner will say, okay, your first year you pay $5 full service, and that's all in price. But in 2020, I'm going to go look at what the operating expenses were. So let's say they were $1 in 2019 and now they're $1.25 in 2020. So I'm going to pass through your pro rata share of that difference. So that 25-cent difference, whatever percent of my building you rent, you're going to now be paying that extra charge. So it's, in one way or another, you're still paying this cost. So in year 2, if you're at a building where the expenses are not being as closely monitored, you may actually be paying more than that triple net building that was $4 triple net plus $1.25 in operating expenses. So it's important to think about what kinds of changes will increase your costs. So the biggest one that we see is a building being sold. So this increases the property tax basis and is the number one reason that you'll see your operating expenses increase. So what can you do to protect yourself? The number one thing that you can do is fully understand, what are the operating expenses for any given building. So it's always our recommendation that you ask for 3 years of operating expense history. Number 2 is going to be reviewing with your broker and attorney on what your lease allows to be passed through. So as we talked about, generally speaking, it's going to allow for operating expenses to be passed through, but typically not larger capital expense items. But there are a few caveats. For example, if there are capital improvements that are done to improve the efficiency of the operating of the building. So if it's going to lower the utility costs by installing solar panels, or if there is some capital expenditure that's done to comply with state regulation, this also can generally be passed through. And at the end of the day, whatever your document says, and there'll usually be an inclusions and exclusions list on what can be passed through, then that's what you're going to be paying for. So number 2 is reviewing these parts of your lease with your broker and your attorney. Number 3, which you're not always going to be able to get, is to ask for a cap on these operating expense pass-throughs. Now again, in a landlord's market, which we're facing here in the Bay Area, you're typically not going to be able to get a cap on your operating expense pass-throughs. The landlord will just say no. But in some markets, or if you are a larger tenant and command more negotiating power, you may be able to ask for this and achieve it. Number 4 is simply minimizing your exposure by minimizing your term. So if you have a shorter term, then there's less chance for the operating expenses to go up, for your building to be sold and the taxes to go up, and for those increased costs to be passed on to you. Now this comes with a few compromises as well. You're not going to be able to have the stability maybe of being in one location for a long time, or the tenant improvement dollars to build out the space how you want if you're doing a shorter term lease, but it is one way of minimizing your exposure. And then finally, last, is working with your broker to understand the incentives and the priorities of your ownership or your landlord. So knowing, do they plan on selling the building? If you're working with a large institutional landlord, then they may be more efficient with the way they operate their buildings, and so that may come with cost savings passed on to you versus a single owner. You may be able to negotiate for more caps on expenses because maybe they don't plan on selling the building and it's not an issue to them, but they may have costlier operating expenses because they don't have the efficiency of scale to save in that regard. So I hope this information was useful, and I'll leave more resources down in the comments below. Let me know what you think, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.